Hey, I'm Alex.
And I'm Caitlin.
And today we're tasting BJCP Category 2 International Lager. In essence, these are a lot of mass-produced lagers. You'll see that it's not consistently from one country or from one continent even. They are from all over, but they all do kind of loosely group together because they have certain things in common.
The first style in this category is International Pale Lager. So if you're following along at home, these are the styles that you can grab to test along with us, the classic examples. They are, there's a lot of them! Asahi Super Dry, Birra Moretti, Corona Extra, Devil's Backbone Gold Leaf Lager, Full Sail Session Premium Lager, Heineken, Red Stripe, or Singa.
So actually, as I'm looking through the list, it looks like we have a Japanese, a Thai, an Italian, a Mexican, 2 American, a Dutch, and a Jamaican beer that make up the classical examples of this style. So like I said, it's from all over the world.
Wait, how is American international?
So these particular ones, the Devil's Backbone, I believe Devil's Backbone is an American brewery, and then Full Sail is right here in Oregon in Hood River. And the reason that it is not listed as an American lager, it is instead categorized here in 2A as an international pale lager, is because even though it's made in the United States, it has more of the characteristics of this style. And notably what that is fewer adjuncts in the mash. It's not necessarily going to have that super light body and lack of flavor of American lager. So even though, again, it is American, it's from Oregon, it's going to be a little bit fuller in flavor, maybe a little bit fuller in body. It might be an all malt beer.
So just in general, more interesting than any of the beers we tried in our previous video. Oh, by the way, that's right here.
To throw an interesting curveball here, I actually somewhat intentionally did not get a classic example. And that's because there is a beer that's getting some distribution right now that I think is kind of interesting. I think it should fit in this category. That is the 21st Amendment's El Sully. This is their Mexican-style lager, and it was a gold medal winner at the 2016 Great American Beer Festival.
I mean, the branding alone has got me.
Yeah.
That's a really fun label.
And to my knowledge, 21st Amendment is nationally distributed, but the way I think of this is it's maybe a slightly more interesting, slightly more craft version of something like Corona or maybe Dos Equis. And because Corona does fall into the classic examples, I thought this would be an interesting thing for us to try. That being said, we might taste and decide in a couple ways it doesn't necessarily fall into this specific category.
So what we're looking for as we're tasting this is a highly attenuated pale lager without strong flavors, typically well-balanced and highly carbonated. Served cold, it is refreshing and thirst-quenching. That sounds very similar to me as similar. Everything that we tried in the American.
So the part of this style that I think is really important is in comments. It does say, international lagers tend to have fewer adjuncts, meaning things like maize or corn, rice, than standard American lagers. They may be all malt, although strong flavors are still a fault. So yes, very similar. But
so not intentionally trying to water it down with some of those other grains, but still keeping it really light.
Absolutely.
Cool. Let's taste it!
All right, so right off the bat, let's get a snapshot of the appearance and the aroma. I would say that's a nice, thick, moussey head, and it seems to be sticking around. We'll come back and look at that a little bit later on.
It's also brilliantly clear. It's just kind of fogging up the glass because it's so cold.
Very cold,
which is exactly how we should be drinking it.
It's a classic lager-like impression. I mean, this is a lot of Pilsner-type malt. There's sort of that grainy, almost corn-like, but again, not really DMS. We're not necessarily getting that cooked corn. I would say it's a nice, fresh, sweet corn.
My first scent impression was a little bit of lemon. And then after that, I got a little bit of that apple blossom like we were noting in some of our previous
certainly
styles.
You can see why this is so close in terms of family to the American style light lager. In terms of intensity, what would you say with the malt and the yeast and the hops? What's really jumping out in the most prominent way in the aroma?
I don't necessarily think that lemon that I got is high intensity, but it is the first thing that jumped out at me.
Interesting.
So as I keep smelling it, I mean, it's there, but it's not the strongest thing.
For me, the malt is what's most prominent. I think the fermentation is very clean, very lager-like. I'm not getting a huge amount of hop, although I think there is maybe something a little citrusy or perhaps a little herbal
And
in
a
the
little
background.
floral, like
Yeah.
I said.
But
it's
really
very light.
it's malt forward, and even then the malt is restrained. This isn't like a jumping out at you aroma, and really to calibrate this, go back and forth between this and an IPA. After smelling an IPA,
yeah.
you won't smell anything here.
No.
So this is a very restrained aroma overall, despite the fact that we're pulling all this stuff out.
For color, I would say pale straw or dark lemonade. Is that fair?
Ooh, interesting.
I mean, it looks,
like it.
it's very, it actually looks kind of like lemonade. I don't know if you can tell in the
And I like
video.
that. There's not a single correct way. There's not like a single set of words that you have to use. It's okay to be creative when writing a score sheet, and the more accurately you can paint a picture of what the beer looks like, the better score sheet you're writing. There's actually
Oh.
there's a little bit more balancing bitterness than I was necessarily expecting in this.
Kind of like our previous video, not that I keep meaning to link to that above, but the mouthfeel is kind of what stood out to me on first impression rather than taste, and it's a lot fluffier and creamier. So I know this is still supposed to be very light and thirst quenching, but there's more to the mouthfeel than the standard American light lagers, for sure.
Just to be checking in, because again, there's no guarantee that this even is a classic example or true to style. This has light to medium body. Would you say that it's still medium?
I wouldn't even go as far as just medium.
Yeah. Yeah, that it can be creamy without being
Right.
full-bodied, and I would agree.
So I
this
would
is-
say it's between light and medium. So medium light is fair to say, right?
I think so. All right, so some descriptors in the flavor. The grain character should be somewhat neutral or show a light, bready, crackery quality, up to moderate corny or malty sweetness.
I definitely get a bready character, and I wouldn't really say crackery. I would say more French bread almost.
And sometimes I like to describe, when I'm saying bready, I like to get even further. Is it fresh baked? Is it crusty? Is it toasted? There are lots of different types of bread.
Is it stale?
This to me is a soft bread. Yeah, maybe a soft French bread, but more reminiscent of the core of it than the crust.
Right.
The crust has that sort of more toasted quality to it, whereas the inner part is just really soft and smooth in its flavor, and then maybe also some of that carries over into the impression in the mouthfeel.
But if French bread could be made out of corn, I think that's what it would be. Because there is
French bread that is 20% corn.
right. Because there's definitely that corn flavor that comes through in the malt
Is that
body.
how cornbread was invented? It does say in the flavor section the balance may vary from slightly malty to slightly bitter, but is relatively close to even. I think the balance here is what is important.
I really like this beer.
It's
actually.
nice, yeah. It's so I think back to just the overall impression, this pretty much is what the overall impression was describing. This is a light, drinkable, well attenuated beer. It's not really jumping out at you in any way, but it's definitely more interesting than some of the American lagers that we tasted last week. I'm not sure I get a ton in terms of flavors in the hops. I do notice some bitterness.
Yeah.
Enough to balance out. I wouldn't call it a bitter beer, but I do get some bitterness. Maybe something a little bit citrusy, but it's delicate, a little floral perhaps.
Jumping back to mouthfeel really quick, it definitely is highly carbonated, and I am
Yeah.
getting those carbonation prickles on my tongue. In a pleasant way, though, because that balances out any bitterness that might be there. So it is overall very
And it should be
balanced.
highly carbonated. That's characteristic of this style.
If we had to rate this one, it is not listed as an official classic example, but would we give it a world-class score,
I think
which
it's-
is 40 to 50?
I think it's right there. I think it's in the 40 range. Going through the guidelines and thinking back to some of those other classic examples that are in there, the Birra Moretti, the Asahi Super Dry, the Red Stripe. I mean, these are all very similar light lagers, and I would say this is right there, but maybe even a little bit more interesting, though I don't think more interesting to a fault. It does specifically say in the guidelines it shouldn't be really standoutish. I think if it had too much more malt character, we might be looking at entering this in some of the other light lager categories, maybe a German, like a Munich Helles. But it falls short of that. It's definitely crisp and clean and basic. There's not too much complexity going on in the malt or the hops. The fermentation is clean. There are no obvious flaws. So I would have a hard time giving this a score lower than 40.
And I think it is useful if you're studying for the BJCP exam and you're trying to study all the different styles. I would really love to try this alongside a a couple of the different classic examples just so you can see, because obviously there is a little bit of a difference between each of them, even though they're all the same style and they're all classic examples. So I think that would really give you a good idea of what the style is supposed to be when you kind of average out everything together. Obviously, we don't want these videos to be that long, though, so we're not doing that. Okay, the second style in this category, we're getting a little bit darker. Color variations, people. This is awesome. If you are following along at home, here are your classic style examples that you can pick up. We've got Brooklyn Lager, Capital Winter Skull, Dos Equis Amber, Shell's Oktoberfest, Yingling Lager.
So really what we're talking about with this style is a slightly maybe scaled up, slightly more complex version of the beer that we just tasted. As compared to the International Pale Lager, this is still a crisp, basic, not terribly complex lager, but it's going to be a little bit darker in color, hence the amber color descriptor, and it might have some maybe biscuity, toasty, might use some caramel malt, so it might have a little caramel character with maybe a little bit of sweetness that comes with that. That being said, it's still not an overwhelmingly complex beer.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but as I'm just kind of reading through some of the descriptions of these first two styles in the category, the descriptions seem very broad. It's almost as if this category specifically is kind of a grab bag of
and
everything.
You can, maybe it's a little bit more apparent with the last one, with the International Pale Lager, where it's, these are these lagers from all over the world. But it is trying to catch a lot of different types of beers and have them fit in the same category.
Mm-hmm. So this might even be one of the tougher categories to judge if it ends up being a category at a competition, just because I imagine that there could be a lot of variation within each style. Yeah,
if you have two beers that are well made, that are technically flawless, trying to figure out which one is a more characteristic example of this style could be a really tall task.
So you might want to try a couple different classic examples in this style.
That being said, if you can, for us living here in Oregon, we had literally one classic example that we were able to get our hands on. We don't have a lot of Brooklyn beers distributed out here. We can't get Capital Brewing. We don't get Shell beers out here. So the beer we will be tasting tonight, the most interesting beer in the world, Dos Equis Amber.
Whoa!
There's color.
That's exciting.
Just to clarify, this is the Dos Equis Amber, not the standard Dos Equis Lager. The standard Dos Equis would not be amber.
So I would definitely say amber, coppery, dark copper, amber.
And definitely brilliant clarity. I struggled a little bit with the last one. I thought maybe there's a little bit of haze, but it was also very cold, so it was hard to say. This is a no-brainer. This is brilliant clarity, as clear a beer as you'll ever see.
Mm-hmm. The head is dissipating very quickly. I don't know if I didn't notice if there was a lot in it when you first poured.
Yeah, nice fluffy head. Definitely get some of that caramel malt character right off the bat. That would be the first thing I would comment on. And I would say it's in moderate intensity.
Aroma, I think.
Caramel. All things considered, a fairly restrained aroma outside of that. It seems to have clean fermentation character, maybe a little something fruity.
Yeah, I can see some dark fruits, some stone fruits maybe.
Yeah, and then maybe something a little bit bready. As it sits and as I get used to it, I'm getting a little bit less of the caramel and a little bit more of sort of a traditional grainy, bready malt character. But it's definitely a malt forward, yet somehow restrained aroma. So again, carbonation is the first thing I noticed. That's a very carbonated beer.
I was distracted by the mouthfeel in terms of that it's definitely medium bodied. Like it's no longer light.
Yeah.
It's clearly medium bodied.
But there's a lot of carbonation.
But yeah, there's carbonation in there.
Which is true to style. Medium to high carbonation. Smooth. Some examples can be creamy. So in terms
I would definitely say smooth. Maybe a little bit creamy.
Mm-hmm. It's actually a little overcarbonated for my taste. I find that a little bit prickly, but I also know that's characteristic of the style.
So the caramel malts come through in flavor as well, but it surprisingly comes through a little bit darker than what the aroma suggested.
Yeah, we were talking about maybe some darker fruits in the aromas, and now I find those two flavors kind of coming together on my palate, where it's almost like the darker caramel flavor is sort of the darker fruit flavor, like a dried date or something.
Yeah.
And I find that to be the most prominent thing in the flavor.
Agreed.
Though I do think there's some bitterness to balance it out. Though I would say this is, of all the beers we've tasted so far, which is 5, this is the sweetest. This has a sweet. It's still a well attenuated beer, but there is that sweetness that I think is coming from like a caramel malt. Overall, here we're looking for a well attenuated malty amber lager with an interesting caramel or toast quality and restrained bitterness. Well attenuated. Often with an adjunct quality, smooth, easily drinkable. There's nothing in that overall impression that I don't think is true to what this beer was. All of that sounds exactly like what we just tasted. So in that sense, I think we are probably looking at a classic example, world-class 40-plus point score. It was pleasant to drink. There were no technical flaws.
Was it the most interesting beer in the world? The third style in this category, we're going even darker still. This is an international dark lager. So, if you're following along at home, the classic style examples are Baltica No. 4 Original, Devil's Backbone Old Virginia Dark, Dixie Blackened Voodoo, ooh, I like that name, St. Pauli Girl Dark, San Miguel Dark, Session Black Dark Lager, and Shiner Bock.
And just a quick caveat about a couple of those beers. The San Miguel they're speaking of is the San Miguel from the Philippines, not the San Miguel from Spain. Not that the San Miguel from Spain would make anything more interesting than Mega Swill Pale Lager. And the Session Black Dark Lager. This is a local beer for us, and I've actually been looking for it, and they seem to not be making it very much anymore. I don't know if this is because of their recent buyout, but what I have been seeing on the store shelves is a Session Black Cherry Lager. That is not a classic example of this beer. That is a fruit beer that has black cherry or black cherry flavor in it. So if for whatever reason you came across a Session Black Cherry Lager, that shouldn't be evaluated here as a classic example. So really when thinking about this, it is again just kind of a step up from some of these other styles we've been trying. Think of it as basically the International Pale Lager, but just with more color. There's not even necessarily a whole lot more complexity. This is a dark lager, but it's made fairly inexpensively. It's not necessarily looking for huge flavor. Don't necessarily expect this to be like a German Bock beer, which is another dark lager. Really is going to be crisper, lighter, and not necessarily as flavorful as some of those other European dark lagers. So today we are going to be tasting Shiner Bock, straight out of Texas. Like I said, we might have done the local version, the Session dark lager, but I'm literally not seeing it anywhere right now. So we'll be doing Shiner.
So compared to the International Amber Lager, it's really not that much darker.
Let me just hold up the SRM. Oh, are you going to do that? You can do that thing.
Yeah, I'll superimpose it.
I think this doesn't, you wouldn't look at this and say, wow, that's a dark beer. It's not a stout, it's not a porter. But I do actually think it's probably within range for this style beer. That being said, the Session dark lager, which I've had, is darker.
It seems more ambery than...
More ambery, but darker than that color, that brown color, right?
So my critique on the color would just be that it's a little more red than what it seems to suggest in the BJCP color spectrum.
So this is interesting. I kind of missed my opportunity to take a quick look at the head. Mine is gone. Not just like mostly dissipated, it's gone. Yours is still hanging around. It's not like you've been, jangling it around and swishing it around. So I don't really know.
I really like to jangle beer. And it does look a little bit, and again, it might be this lovely lighting because we are choosing to film these videos in the evening, but it seems a little bit off-white. Everything that we've had to this point, the head has been white, like very white and fluffy.
Definitely malt forward, and I still think it's kind of in the caramel spectrum, but getting closer to like a toffee caramel than what we had in the Dos Equis Amber. I'm actually going to go back and forth just for the comparison. I would say the overall malt aroma of the Dos Equis is more assertive, but the specific type of malt aroma in this is maybe just a little bit on the darker spectrum.
Maybe like caramelized brown sugar.
Yeah.
Where it's a little bit cooked.
Yeah, like, or maybe even scorched a little bit. All right, so I'm really dying to get into the flavor, but I do just want to really quickly comment. I think this is interesting whenever you can catch it, and this probably isn't coming up so much on camera, but the bubbles in this are really striking. I can see
Oh, yeah.
carbonation just flying to the surface. So I'm excited to see what that actually contributes to the mouthfeel. But I might actually comment on it in the appearance just because it's so striking. All right, I'm going to taste this now.
Me too, I guess.
It's kind of surprisingly uninteresting. Do you agree?
Yeah.
But that's actually really characteristic of this style. We're looking for something that, yes, there's the color adjustment, but all things considered, this is still a fairly basic, fairly stripped down lager. It's not super high in alcohol. It's not super high in flavor. There's not a whole lot of hop, a whole lot of malt.
I would actually say this is even a lighter bodied than the amber. So there's like
All
less
things-
mouthfeel going on even.
I think this might be the least complex beer we've had today, despite being the darkest. So some descriptors out of the guidelines. Low to medium malty sweetness, I would agree. But it actually says with medium low to no caramel and or roasted malt flavors. So it's acceptable to have low quantities or none, but it shouldn't actually be going beyond that. And I would say it's living up to that. There is very little.
Which is interesting because it's so apparent in the aroma.
Moderately crisp finish. The balance is typically somewhat malty. I would agree. It's certainly not balanced toward hops. The fermentation is super clean, so it's not like this is a yeast-driven beer.
Right.
So if anything, it is a malty beer. It's just so restrained.
So actually, this is a good thing kind of to keep in mind that if you are ever judging another dark lager category where you come across a beer and you're like, this looks right, it smells right, but when I taste it, it's just kind of a little bit boring, you could say in that overall impression, hey, try entering this as an international dark lager. It might do better there. That's really great feedback on a competition score sheet.
I'm just looking ahead to what we're going to be tasting next week. We're getting into the Czech lagers, and there is a category there. 3D is Czech dark lager, and Czech lagers are incredibly characterful. There's all sorts of stuff going on between the water chemistry and the hops and the malt and maybe the mashing methods. I could totally see someone trying to do a Czech dark lager, but then missing the mark in some way in those characters and ending up having something that would fit better in this category. I could also see an inventive, creative homebrewer trying to do something like this and then accidentally making something more along the lines of a Czech dark lager. So it's a good thing to be aware of the different styles and how they might fit.
So then if you were scoring this beer, it is a classic example. We feel pretty good about pretty much all the description, again, in that 40 to 50 range.
No flaws here. This is it's a good beer.
As always, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like this video if it helped you out in your BJCP study ventures. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, even if you don't really get YouTube notifications or anything like that. The subscriber numbers help us a little bit, maybe.
We're having a lot of fun doing this, but obviously we care a lot what you are getting out of it. I'm really eager to hear if people are tasting along with us, maybe getting some of these beers and watching the video while you taste it yourself. If you're having any sorts of experiences, if you want to pick a fight, if you want to, well, please don't fight. We're from the Midwest. We're kind of conflict averse. But if you want to agree or disagree or add to the discussion in any way, please feel free to comment below. We'll be watching those comments as we continue to post these videos moving forward.
Yeah, because I don't know if we mentioned this before, but I'm studying for the BJCP tasting exam. Alex is kind of studying to retake it, and hopefully...
I'm studying for the written exam, which is a whole different beast. We'll get into that far down the road.
But it helps us too. We want to study along and interact with you guys too. And we also want to know if you find any interesting styles that you feel like could fit their way into some of these classic examples too. So we will see you next week when we go over category 3 Czech lagers.
I'm so excited.
Cheers.
Cheers. Yay, beer.